Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm senior literary agent and author Heather Cashman.
I'm author and writing coach Stephanie Bearce.
And I'm author and writing coach Nicki Jacobsmeyer.
Our mission is to nurture and enrich established writers throughout their publishing journeys.
We welcome all genres, age groups, and publishing paths through video podcasts, online webinars, in-person retreats, and more.
We're here to help you conquer your path.
We are very excited for this episode. We have editor Foyinsi Adigbonmire, who is at Feiwel Friends, which is an imprint of Macmillan Children's. Yeah. Stephanie, can you tell us about
I would love
Foyinsi?
to. We're so excited to have Foyinsi here. At Feiwel Friends, she works with commercial middle grade young adult fiction and is open to contemporary mystery, romance, and fantasy while enjoying a lighthearted stories with conversational narrative voices. She was named a 2021 Publishers Weekly Star Watch honoree, and her acquisitions include New York Times bestseller Ace of Spades and indie bestseller Dear Wendy. When not reading or thinking about her very large to-be-read pile, she can be found watching black sitcoms from the 90s and early 2000s, obsessing over crafting, or being sucked into Twitter and TikTok.
Yes. That is me.
So I want to hear about your crafting. What do you like to craft?
Yes, I like to craft really all types of things. I'm not very good at them, but I like to do it just for fun. Or I like to paint. I like to draw. And I'm very excited because me and some of my friends started a craft club. So we do different types of crafts each time we meet.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah, it's really, we just started it recently.
Idea.
Yeah. And it's just nice to get back into it because I think for so long I got very into it has to be perfect and look a certain way, but it's nice to just be able to just let go. And we made charm bracelets one time, which was really cool. And I wanted to do that, but it felt so intimidated, but it was actually very easy. So,
oh, that's so fun. It's so fun to hear about the other aspects of your life.
And also how to be creative, because I feel like so much in publishing, we don't get to finish things or have things finished quickly. And so having that ability to have something that you created quickly is nice.
Yeah. And even allowing myself to leave it unfinished, where the end of the craft club meeting may come and I may not have done everything that I wanted to do or drawn everything I wanted to draw, and okay, I can always come back to this later. It's not the end of the world. So yeah.
That's really fun. And I think that's, since you are working in such a creative environment, exploring different parts of your creativity is exciting too. So let's talk a little bit about creating in narrative voice. What elements do you think are most essential in creating a distinctive narrative voice?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I would say perspective is really important. I think really giving the reader a sense of whose eyes are we seeing the story from, whose eyes are we seeing the scene from, is probably the thing that I think of the most when I think of narrative voice. And when I say perspective, yes, that's first person, third person, but I also think about, is this an unnamed narrator? Is this the main character? Is this a side character? Just thinking about whose eyes are we getting this scene from, or if it's character voice, who is this character? And how can you convey that through the way they speak?
Speaking of that, so what is the difference for you then between the narrative voice being different from the character voice? Can you go into that just a little bit? Because I find that very interesting.
So I would say character voice. When I say character voice, not just the main character, but side characters as well, dialogue, all of that kind of goes into character voice for me. And then narrative voice for me is just the narrator, who is telling the story overall and whose eyes are we seeing the story from overall. But yeah, character voice. I think sometimes people only associate it with the main character or the hero or the protagonist. But yeah, I would say it applies to even if there's a very tertiary character that only appears in one scene or only has one line, they can still have and should have a distinctive voice as well.
Yeah. Sometimes when I think of narrative voice, maybe this is weird, so correct me if I'm not thinking about this correctly, but When I think of narrative voice, sometimes I think of the overall tone of the
Yes,
manuscript.
yeah. Oh,
It's
that's a
almost
big
like the
one. Yeah,
personality of the
yes,
narrator.
yeah. That's why I always say, I think even if your narrator is unnamed or is like a third person narrator, I still think there's a way to inject personality into that, whether that's through humor. I always say in my bio, I enjoy conversational narrative voices. So that's more informal narrative voices where it feels like the narrator, whoever they are, whether they are the main character, whether they are unnamed, like where it feels like they're like speaking to a friend. So yeah, I'd say that's a great point as well, that like narrative voice really tone is such a big part of that.
Okay, so we have all of these characters, we have your narrative voice. How do we balance maintaining an authentic voice with meeting the expectations of a particular genre or a particular audience or market?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think a big question that a lot of writers probably
Yes.
have. Yeah, I would say like in terms of genre or market, I like to think of them more as like guidelines rather than rigid like rails almost where you can't veer off of this path. I like to think of it as just here are certain expectations that readers are going to have, like whether you're writing an adult book versus a middle grade book. Like both voices should sound very different, or whether you're writing a fantasy versus a romance. The voices probably are going to sound different, but that's not to say that like you have to follow like a strict set of rules. So in terms of balancing them, I would say the biggest thing is, again, for me, especially when it comes to narrative voice, is just thinking about, again, whose eyes are we seeing the story from? Whether or not this is, let's say you're writing an adult book, and some adult books have like child characters. And while there's still certain expectations that it's an adult book, if your child character is the narrator, then there's still a certain voice that they should have. And
Right.
again, a certain perspective that they should have, or thinking about what are the things that this type of person or this type of narrator would notice about the world or point out about the world. Where if it's, let's say, someone who, let's say your narrator is someone who is really into like fashion or just pointing that, then that's something that like through the voice you would describe what people are wearing maybe a lot more than another story might. But yeah, I think the great thing about like genre and category is that there's exceptions to every rule. And even if you look within the genre or like market or space that you want to write in, if you pick even 3 books from them, like I'm sure you'll see that they all have generally different voices. And I think a great way to look at that even is anthologies. And yeah, I think anthologies are such a great way to explore voice and see how other people handle voice, where they usually have a unifying theme, whether that's the genre, whether that's the age category, there's something that unifies them. And yet you'll see that like the way the voices are handled from story to story can differ so much. And I've worked on 3 anthologies now, so I'm not an expert, but it's something that I've like really noticed working on them. I have one called Mermaids Never Drown that's like all about mermaids. And so they're all like pretty much YA fantasy stories, but the voices sound so different, where like one is more like descriptive and lush descriptions, where another one is more contemporary and more this is how a teenager today would speak. So yeah, I think anthologies are a great way to just explore like how do people handle different voices even within genre constraints or age category constraints.
I love that. I have a great
That's
way
such
to
a-
study
yeah.
voice that I hadn't thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense. What are your 3 anthologies
Yeah.
that you've worked on? Just so we can look them
Yes.
up and go read.
Yeah, so I've worked on Study Break, which is an anthology all about, they're all set on the same fictional college campus. And so again, they're all unified by the fact that they take place in college. They're all contemporary, but the voices of the different authors are so distinct. And then I also worked on Mermaids Never Drown, as I mentioned. And then connected to Mermaids Never Drown is another anthology called Fairies Never Lie. That's all about fairies.
Fun.
Yeah, that's a fun one because the first book in that series is Vampires Never Get Old. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
just all these different supernatural creatures. But again, just seeing how authors take this loose prompt and make it their own and make it their distinct voices and also voices that are authentic for each story.
That is a great way to really study voice and
Yeah,
unique
it really
narrative
is.
role. I really
Yeah.
like that. Do you think that you can teach an author or writer how to have a unique voice? Is that something you can teach, or is that something they just have to know or feel?
Yeah, this is something I've been on the fence about, this kind
Mhm.
of question of can you teach voice? Because when I do read submissions as an editor, voice is something that stands out to me when I
Mhm.
read submissions as an editor. And am I enjoying the voice?
Yeah.
Am I not? And usually if I'm not, like that's usually a pretty strong indication for me to pass on
Okay.
something, because voice is so subjective that I don't think it's right for me to say, because I don't like this voice, I'm going to change it
Mm-hmm.
completely. Yeah, that's, again, I struggle with that, because I think you can get better with voice. I think you can, but it might be one of those things where like practice is where it really comes in handy, and just like writing different types of projects and even short stories, again, I think are a great way to kind of look at voice and tackle voice in a way that is not expansive, in a way that's constrained. Or even poetry, like voice plays a huge part in poetry. And like when I was studying creative writing in school, like poetry was where I leaned towards, even though I enjoy prose and poetry equally. But yeah, so I think just looking at poetry as well, and just looking at what pieces do I enjoy, or reading books within whatever genre you want to write in, or even whatever books like you've read already that you enjoyed, like going back and looking at, okay, what stood out to me about the voice, or what did I enjoy about the voice. And again, it wasn't really until I like entered publishing that I realized, okay, I tend to lean towards like more like casual narrative voices, more conversational narrative voices. And that kind of informs my writing as well, like where usually what I write tends to also be very conversational. And so, yeah, can you teach voice? I think you can give tips on voice, but I think that's the kind of thing where you just really have to just write and
Dig deep
hopefully
and find it
hope.
inside yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's any specific formula of here's how to write like a
Mm-hmm.
conversational narrative voice, or here's how to write like, I don't know. Yeah.
It seems to me voice is something that at least I've noticed people, who like authors I've worked with. I have noticed that, especially when I was doing pitch wars or when I was working with clients, especially as a new agent,
Mm-hmm.
that you'll write one or two or three books, and then somewhere in there, it's like a leap occurs.
Yeah.
Like this leap occurs where the writing just solidifies. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like people really have to work to find their voice.
Yes. Yeah.
So in some ways, it is something that only practice really can do.
Yeah.
But then in other ways, I do feel like there are things you can think about with
You
voice,
can. Yeah.
like you said before, what am I noticing? What is
Mhm.
my character noticing in this scene
Yeah.
that only they would notice? Or
Yeah.
that what is it that they aren't seeing
Exactly.
someone else is seeing? Or things like the specific phrasing. I
Mhm.
feel you can teach certain elements of that where some people are going to talk more short and clipped and other people
Yes.
are going to
Yeah.
talk
Have the
longer,
very meandering sentences. Yeah.
things like that. But I think overall, it is just something that has to be, you just got to
Yeah.
put
Exactly.
your time in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also sometimes like even writers who have written more than one book before, like they might start a new story and like struggle to find that character's voice, or
Yes.
struggle to find that narrator's voice. Or you might find that like you start a new story and it just sounds
Yeah.
too similar to the last story that you wrote, that and if it's not like a within the same world, then you probably don't want it to sound very similar to the last one. So yeah, again, I think sometimes it's just the kind of thing where you have to write and let yourself like be guided almost by the narrator, and kind of discover the voice as you go.
Yeah. And I have found that too with points of view. Like
Hmm.
there will be times when I start a manuscript and I write it in three different points of view
Yeah,
just to
exactly.
see
Yeah,
like which
exactly.
feels right.
Yeah, and
It's a
that's
lot of work.
yeah, and that's such a great way to tackle it, because again, point of view like plays such a part in storytelling and in voice. So it might also be the thing where it's like, maybe the narrator you chose, or the type of narrator you chose, is not the right type of person to tell the story you want to tell. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
really like thinking about all these things, and again, letting yourself discover the
Have you
story
ever
as you
had
go.
that happen when you've looked at a manuscript that you like the story, but you think maybe the author's working from the wrong point of view or something? Is that something you can work with the author on or not? Or is that,
I mean, that's something I've definitely heard other
Mhm.
editors have that experience of, maybe something is dual POV and we actually maybe don't need one of the POV
Mhm.
characters, or vice versa, where it's single POV and then it's, oh, there's this other character that it might be good to get the story
Mhm.
from. I personally have never done that, but I'm open to it if that kind of like thought occurs to me naturally as I'm reading the submission or reading the manuscript, and I'm open to suggesting it and seeing what can be done. But yeah, I've never really read anything that like struck me as, oh, this should be told from a different perspective. So yeah.
So, another thing that I just thought of, one thing that really changes voice for me is present or past tense.
Yes. Yeah.
And I feel like there are some people who are masters at it and you don't even realize it's present tense until you're like almost through all the way through the book. So that's like some kind of trend. I feel like we never used to see that, but now I see it in my inbox
There's more present tense.
all the time. Do you think that there are current publishing trends as far as voice goes?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've seen more stories told in present tense than maybe would have been done before, which I enjoy. I don't think I really have a preference between present tense and past tense, but I do think present tense sometimes can help with the sense of urgency. We're watching this play out with the character, but I don't think there's a right or wrong in terms of which tense makes sense for the story. And then I'm trying to think of what else. I feel like with, and maybe middle grade to extent, like at least as far as the submissions I see, I think they do mainly tend to be in first person versus third person. And with the occasional second person once in a while. One of the stories in the Mermaids Never Drown anthology, I believe the first story actually is in second person. And I know that's a POV that is not a super popular one. Yeah, like especially to sustain it for an entire novel.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a skill. But again, there are exceptions to every rule. So if that's just what works best for the story you're trying to tell, then that's what works best. But yeah, so I'd say I see a lot of first person and usually first person past tense.
Interesting. So do you have any advice for people who are writing multiple points of view and how to make those voices distinct?
Yeah, that is a great question. Because I think that's one of the biggest things people run into when writing dual POV or multi POV stories is I think most readers want to feel like when they've started a new chapter or entered into a new POV, they want to feel like, okay, like I don't have to keep flipping to try to figure out like who's the narrator here.
I don't have to go back to the chapter.
Yeah, exactly, and be like, oh, who's this?
I always have to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which that has happened before. And it's interesting because I mainly write in single POV, but I have written dual POV here and there. And I think my approach was mainly in terms of sentence structure, especially. I think that can be a really visual way to indicate who's speaking. And so where I may have had one character that speaks very like meandering, very long sentences, very like stream of consciousness almost, where another character may use more like short clip, like straight to the point sentences or like less quote unquote flowery language, I think is another way to help distinguish between voices sometimes is just, again, thinking about formal versus informal ways of speaking or using slang versus not using slang, or again, using more flowery poetic language versus not is a way to do that. And then again, just thinking about what are the differences between these two characters or between these multiple characters. Because if you're writing more than one POV, in theory, there's a reason that we want to there's a reason we're seeing this specific scene from this specific character's eyes versus any of the other heroes that you created. And so thinking about what makes them different. Is it like maybe the characters are from different areas? So like maybe one is from London, one is from the US or whatever. And so the way they speak there should be some variation in how they speak. Or maybe if you're writing an adult novel, like maybe one is like 22 and another is like 35. There's probably going to be some differences in the way they speak. Or even thinking about like where people are from, that's going to really affect people's environment and where they grew up in. That plays a huge part in how we speak. And
like, do they say soda or do they say pop?
Yeah, exactly. Like things like that. Yeah, do they speak really quickly? Do they speak slower, more music?
Right.
Yeah, and even just I think voice and trying to convey voice. I think another good way to look at it is to just observe like the people around you and how they speak, and even texting as well. I text different friends, and even if I'm not looking at their like contact name, like I can gauge like, okay, this person like maybe uses more like proper grammar or like punctuation when they text versus this person is more like all lowercase, which blows my mind. Where I tend to be the like proper grammar, like my friends say I text like an HR person. So, you know,
or
that's
an
one way.
editor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the way I text versus the way one of my friends text, or the way my 19-year-old little
Yeah.
sister text where she's all lowercase and no emojis and all of that. Again, visually, if you hold up our text side by side, you usually can see these were two different people that sent these messages. So looking at written communication and like everyday life can be a good way to convey voice or find ways to convey voice. Or there are certain like phrases that people will use often, and sometimes there is overlap. Like me and my friends, we tend to adopt the same phrases, but again, the way we convey them may be different and things like that. So because books tend to be a more visual medium, especially as a writer, you're not necessarily writing a script for an audiobook, even though some books become audiobooks. So you really have to rely on like visual cues to like convey people's voices and characters' voices and narrative voices. And if you're lucky, it'll become an audiobook, but not everyone's going to listen to that audiobook. So again, finding like visual ways to convey, okay, this is like this person speaking because they speak in very short, clipped, straight to the point sentences versus this other character is very wordy, or like this other character uses certain terms that they rely on a lot based on where they grew up or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And shouldn't we should be, even in single POV, we should be treating each character
yes,
like
very much. Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you like, you definitely, for the most part, don't want a case where, let's say, 2 to 3 characters are having a conversation and it's mainly dialogue and it's hard to distinguish who is speaking. Yeah.
I think there's so much to voice. Just getting it nailed down is hard, but some people are really talented in experimenting and having new, unconventional uses. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you work with people who are using unconventional voice in a manuscript?
That's a good question. I would say, like, have I come across unconventional voice? I would say like short story that I mentioned that was in second person.
Unconventional. That would be interesting.
I remember reading the first draft of it like the first time, and I think the very first sentence even is like you ... So you immediately know this is second person. And I remember being like, oh, that's interesting. You don't see that often. And as I continued reading the story, it just felt like the perfect choice for the story because the story is very atmospheric and it's about a siren and it takes place in the ocean. And it just felt very like musical, and sirens like are about their voices, actually, interestingly enough. And so it just felt, yes, this is like a great way to convey this story. And so as far as editing it, I don't think it really required much editing, actually. The author was very talented, but I think it was just the kind of thing where it was like, again, at first I was like, oh, this is different. But then once I like accepted that this is second person, it just was like, okay, now I can really allow myself to enjoy it. So don't be afraid to like experiment. Or again, sometimes there's adult books that have child voices in them, or children's books that have adult voices in them. And just whatever serves the story. And I always even suggest to people, like, if you find yourself like thinking like, oh, maybe I should tell this story in a different voice or whatever, take one scene if you've already written it and just try it in a different voice. Try it in second person, try it in past tense, try making it more flowery or making it less flowery. It doesn't hurt to just try it. And I always tell people, no one's going to know how many attempts it took you to write it. Even me as the editor, I get manuscripts from authors, and even my repeat authors. To me, it might be this is their first draft, but for them, it might be this is the 10th draft we've written of this story. No one is really going to know. So again, there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, let me take this scene, and if I wanted to tell it in third person, what would that look like? Or if I wanted to tell it like in present tense, what would that sound like? What would have to change? Like all of that.
Yeah, I like that. And it's like you experimenting with your crafts. Take some time and play with it, and just be loose and try and see which one works. So thank you. That's good advice for us writers out there trying to figure it out.
Yeah. And I know this is easier said than done. I was just telling someone like, this is all very as I say, not as I do, because I'm also very much get in my head about writing and I know it can be so easy to, I have to do this and the voice has to do this and there has to be emotional stakes and there has to be like to convey this and I have to show, don't tell, and like all these things that feel like rules. And it can be hard to know, okay, where do I even begin? And I'm constantly telling people, again, just start. It's better to have something on the page. And a few years ago, I realized, I enjoy being an editor because I like revision. I don't like drafting. Like a blank page is so daunting to me. But like when there's something on the page and I'm like, okay, I can work with this, I can tweak this. But again, I know that's all easier said than done because I get to the drafting and I'm like, oh, there's so many different directions I can like take this. I don't know. So this is advice for myself as well. Like I'm trying to really get better about, again, just experimenting, just playing. Or even if I make a choice for the book that ends up ultimately not working, no one's going to know but me. Really. Yeah.
And editing, that's the brilliance of editing.
Exactly. Yeah.
You can undo or redo anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think
keep all of your old drafts.
yes.
Don't throw anything away.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you want to have a file or a document for deleted scenes or deleted passages, do that. Because you never know where you can repurpose it to like a somewhat other part of the story or a whole different story. But yeah, and I think that's the thing that like it's hard to remember sometimes that like when you're reading a book, you're reading a finished product or what the author and editor consider a finished product. But you're, for the most part, you're not reading the first draft that author wrote. So you don't know what it took to like get to there. Because I know sometimes like me and one of my friends who's also a writer, we can get very like, oh, I just read this really great book, like like on a craft level, the writing was so strong, like such beautiful lines, like so many things that you can quote from the book, and oh, we should just break our pen. That's our favorite thing. It's just we should just break our pens now. Like why even bother? Like we'll never get to this level. But I always try to like remind us.
I was like, do you know how comforting that is to hear from an editor that is
yeah, because I'm an editor, it's easier for me to be like, okay, I've seen books at different stages. I know sometimes you can have a really rough first draft and then the final draft is the most beautiful thing that I think anyone's ever seen. But of course, writing is subjective. So I always try to allow us to sit in that space for a little bit and that frustration of we'll never be able to do it. But I always try to end on like, okay, we don't know what it took to get to that level. Yes, these sentences are really beautiful, but we don't know how many times that author had to rewrite that sentence to get it to sound as beautiful as it does. And again, that's the beauty of it. No one will really know.
But sometimes you want them to know. I bless.
You know? I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this was my blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. And it is helpful to hear when it's, oh, this was like, it took 10 drafts for the author to get to this story. Even because, again, there's some authors that like, you look at and it's, oh, they've written like 5 books now and every one of them, like they knock it out of the park. And the thing about writing is that it's so specific to each project where you may like, again, you may be 10 books in and you've written 10 books and they've been great. And then you come to write the 11th book and you're just struggling, or it's taking longer than you thought to find the story. Or that's the, I guess, unfortunate thing about writing is that there's not really any, oh, I've done this 10 times before, so I know the formula. Each story can need different things or require a different skill. And sometimes it's like, you're just not, which sounds weird to say, but like you're not where you need to be to tell a specific story sometimes. So sometimes it's like you need to get a little more writing under you and a couple more books under you before you can go back to that one story. That's okay. Now that I've like learned all these different things about voice, and like now I can write this like multi POV story that I've been wanting to tell and stuff. Yeah, it's hard. I can't like, let me tell you.
It is so hard.
It is hard, but it's encouraging to hear from you as an editor that sees a lot of stories that it can be a hot mess, and we can get it to that point where you have the beautiful lyrical language and tell the wonderful story. So that helps.
And you also don't know what will stick with people. Or what, because again, something me and my friend talk about is like wanting to be quotable, where people are like making t-shirts with a certain catchphrase from your book, or I don't know, that's just like the dream. And again, I think the feeling is that it's the like really like deep philosophical sounding flowery like language, and sometimes it is that, but sometimes it's like with John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, where it was like the okay question mark okay period, like that's such a simple like thing, but that blew up. That became a huge thing. Or even Katniss in the Hunger Games, I volunteer tribute. Again, that's such a simple sentence, and I don't know if Suzanne thought when she was writing that that would be the thing that people hold on to or made the odds be ever in your favor, like where it's, you just never know what is going to stick with people. So again, it's just, that's what I try to remind myself and my friend as well, is that we may not write a certain way that other authors do, but that doesn't mean that people aren't going to be like, oh, this was a really great sentence, or this is my favorite phrase in all of this, or whatever.
I think when you write authentically from your heart, there are going to be people out there that it resonates with.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's how we are. Yeah. That's how we connect.
Yeah. And I think the great thing too is that there's an audience out there for everything. If you like something, if you're like, I want to write second person present tense because that's what I enjoy reading, like, as much as we're all different, I would say we're not all unique in that, oh, you're the only person that's going to enjoy second present tense. There's going to be other people that enjoy that as well. So that's something I always tell myself too, where it's like, again, even if it feels like, oh, this is so basic or this is not this other author, if I enjoy it, there's going to be a whole lot of other people who enjoy it as well. And it's just obviously the difficulty is finding those people and getting to those people. But again, like, it's totally fine.
So when you first read a manuscript, I do this all the time in my inbox because I'm like you. I feel like what grabs me first is the voice of something. And often I find myself just going down to the sample pages rather than reading anything else.
I don't read pitches before I read the manuscript.
Yeah. So what stands out to you? I know you said that you like the kind of easygoing, more modern voice, but in terms of narrative voice, what usually stands out to you as far as maybe quality, and how does that influence your decision making?
Yeah, I would say rhythm and flow of the voice or the sentences like really stand out to me. Again, maybe because I have somewhat of a poetry background. And that's not to say I'm like reading these sentences out loud or anything, but sometimes it's as I'm reading, I'm like, oh, is this flowing well, or am I like stumbling a little bit? Or like that's how I ended up noticing that I'm not always a fan of the kind of very like short staccato sentences in a row. I do think they have a place and they can create a very distinct effect if that's what's intended. But I find that I like a mix of longer sentences and shorter sentences to like help with that flow and not make it feel so monotonous. So that's something that really stands out to me. That's where I'll say I can work with an author on that in terms of when I'm doing line edits, which is when I'm looking at the very nitty gritty sentence by sentence, word by word telling of the story. That's when I can say, oh, maybe you can combine these two sentences so that they flow a little better. This is a really long sentence. Maybe we can cut this up a little bit just for flow and ease of reading. So that's where I would like work with an author in terms of like sentence structure. But yeah, as far as what, as I said earlier about first person or third person or dual POV or single POV, I leave it up to the author. If it's like, oh, this voice is more formal or informal, I'm not necessarily going to be like, oh, this voice is more formal than I usually like, so let me like force the author to move it in this direction or whatever, because I just don't think that's my place, because I guess I am an editor, but I don't think that, because again, voice is so subjective that just because I tend to prefer like a certain type of voice doesn't mean that's the type of voice that's going to work for every single story. And again, I've read a number of books where I'm like, oh, like I normally wouldn't gravitate to this kind of voice, but it just reads so well or flows so well that I'm enjoying the story.
For me, it's a matter of, can I lose myself?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And once, if I start reading a sample and I get to the end and don't realize that I've been reading,
exactly. Yeah.
Then I'm like, oh, that
Oh
is,
yeah, no, that's a big indicator. Yeah. Because sometimes, because I try to read 20-ish pages of every submission. So if I get to a point where I'm like, find myself constantly looking at the page count where I'm like, okay, I'm on page 10. Okay, 10 pages, where to go? Or okay, there's 8 pages. It feels almost I'm there. Oh my gosh, it's 8 pages suddenly feels like so much more to read until I can be done with this. Then yeah, I'm like, okay, I'm probably not the best for this voice, whatever it is.
So on those kind of manuscripts where you've got something in your inbox, what are some of the common mistakes that you see in terms of voice and things that will make you like, I'm only 5 pages in and I'm done?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I feel like often it's not even voice so much, but I will say with voice, maybe inconsistency in a way that doesn't feel intentional, where again, it might be that like we're following different characters, so the way the voice feels different, and that's fine. But sometimes if it's, okay, we seem to be in the same perspective or the same POV, and there's inconsistency in like the way the voice sounds or the way the narrator is telling the story, that might give me pause a little bit. But I mean, I guess I'm lucky that I don't really see that a lot even. Yeah. So again, something that like would give me pause is really usually just more like pacing or other story things outside of voice. But
also when things just don't flow. Over and over I say, you should read this out loud. You should have someone else read this out loud to you.
Exactly.
And see where they stumble and see where, because I feel like a lot of what I see with voice in that's problematic
Yeah.
is that it's not smooth.
Yeah,
It just doesn't.
exactly. Yeah. And another way, that's a great suggestion, especially because that can help you also sometimes pick up on repetition that you may not pick up on if you're just reading something visually. Because don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of repetition and parallel structure. Again, I'm coming from poetry.
Right.
But at the same time, when it doesn't feel intentional, it can affect the pacing and make the story feel slower, where it's okay. Again, I'm like 5 pages in, but it doesn't feel like I've learned much about the character or the world or anything because the voice is just saying the same thing over and over again and in ways that doesn't feel interesting enough to me, which again is all subjective. So I think reading it out loud, having other people read it is such a great way to see, okay, what are the things that where it's okay, like the narrator has explained this a little too granularly, especially for the beginning pages, like where it's okay, maybe we don't need this detail now. Or
I see that all the time too.
Yeah, or maybe you've driven the point home. We get it. This character's so
Yes.
like
It's raining. We know.
exactly. Yeah, describe some people are going to be into that. Some people are going to want lush descriptions of every single rain drop, and some people are not. So again, just thinking about who your reader is really going to inform voice too.
Makes a lot of sense.
Oh goodness. So much to learn, so much to do.
And again, it's hard when it's like there are all these like guidelines and rules and things you have to keep in mind.
For first draft though, I hope people just throw all of it out the window.
Yeah.
Honestly, I really do, because I feel like that first draft is for you.
Mm-hmm.
You should be playing, you should be enjoying, you should be exploring.
I always tell people, like, I wish I could turn off the editor part of my brain, like when drafting, and turn it back on for revision.
Me too.
Which is hard, but I think again that's what stops me a lot of the time, where it's like there's this blank page, I have to do all these things, and this one scene or this one sentence has to convey 5 million things, and then I get bogged down into the exact wording and stuff. And again, I always tell people, like, just write, like you can fix it later. And again, very much advice for myself.
It's good advice though. What do you think about when you're writing to try and help yourself? Should you read in genre? Should you read out of genre? What do you think helps?
I would say mainly reading in genre, just to know what the kind of expectations, conventions, all of that are. But I think it also doesn't help to read out of genre, just to see maybe there are pieces that you can take into your own writing, where maybe there's a certain like structure or format or again voice that's like maybe not common in the genre you want to write in, but maybe that's what serves the story best. I'm also a fan of like having almost interstitials or little parts of the story that kind of veer off in terms of like voice, where it's like, oh, like the book, what is it called? Angel of Greenwood by Randy Pink, where there's a moment where because the story is set around the time of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it's set in the neighborhood of Greenwood. And there's a point in the story where the voice switches to be from the point of view of the town itself. So the city of Greenwood is now speaking. And it just, all of Randy's writing is just very beautiful and lyrical. But like little things like that, where it's, again, that may not be conventional in YA historical, but that was just such a like great way to do it. Or incorporating poetry into like your prose or things like that. So I think it can be helpful to read other genres just to see what other people are doing. And I'm such a big exactly. And I'm such a big fan of picking and choosing and trying things out. And when I was like in school, a lot of my poetry classes was like trying out different forms of poetry, where it's like writing a haiku versus a pantoum versus a sonnet and all of that, and being able to see, okay, like these are I really enjoyed this structure, what about this structure do I enjoy? I'm not a big fan of iambic pentameter. It feels very like, a little too tough for me, but at least I'm aware of it, so that maybe someday I do want to like give it a try or incorporate it into one of my stories or things like that. So it's just really cool to just see what other people have come up with and like how you can like make it your own as well.
I think that's such good advice from both of you, that to play with it, to experiment, to let yourself explore, but maybe do it before you send it to the editor.
Potentially.
But I think that gives writers a lot of freedom to try and explore and try new things. And you let me know when you put that iambic pentameter in. Yes.
Yeah. Let's see if I ever do that.
No, I was taking a class, and it was a poetry class. And I remember at the same time I was reading a novel, and I can't even remember who the author was. I think it might have been a Tom Clancy novel or something like that. But just in the middle of the book, there was this paragraph where everything was in meter.
Yeah.
Like it was a whole paragraph in meter. And I thought, this is really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And so if you do study these different forms and different types of writing and language and all of that kind of stuff, it really does all inform
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah.
And it can make you just a better writer, all of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And it may not be the kind of thing where you separate the part and call it out and it's here's this like sonnet all of a sudden.
Right.
Maybe like more like buried into the story
Yeah.
or layered in, but it could be such a fun piece for like almost like an if you know type of thing where like readers like, oh, I noticed that this is in meter, like that's so cool. That adds another layer to the story. I tend to be a fan of like mixed media format storytelling where it's I have one of my books, Loving 280 Characters or Less, that's told through blog posts and emails and tweets. So there's a lot of different voices going on in that story. And yeah, I just find it really interesting just to see how even format of something like where, you know, an email and a tweet usually are not going to sound the same, or even if they're written by the same person, or a text message conversation or things like that, where it's like, again, just a really cool added layer and voice can really like inform that as well.
That's so cool. What a great point. Foyinsi, we're so grateful that you came.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Yeah, this was really fun.
I have learned so much, and hopefully our listeners will.
Yeah, I hope so.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and I hope people like feel encouraged. I think
sometimes
it can be really easy to feel discouraged and feel like, where do I begin? And yeah, I have that very much. But yeah, again, just like really allowing yourself to, as we've been saying, just play around and experiment, and like having a trusted reader, I think is also very helpful, where maybe you're protective of your words or you're self-conscious about your words, where maybe you don't want to send it out to 5 people, but having at least one person that you can send to and be like, okay, here's this one scene or here's this one chapter, like I tried something new, what do you think? And stuff like that, I think is a great way to do it as well.
Excellent advice. I'm excited. I'm going to go play.
I'm glad. Yeah, no, I'm brainstorming, write a book, like draft a book.
I will.
Good.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Wayward Writers.
Let's connect. Find us at waywardwriters.com, X, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
See you next time. Conquer your path.